Now, for some reaction to yesterday's MPC announcement, let's have a chat to Busi Mavuso, who's the CEO of Business Leadership South Africa. Busi, lovely to have you. Thanks very, very much for joining us.
Morning, Leanne. Thank you very much for inviting me.
I don't think there was a surprise to the 25 basis point repo rate increase. I mean, that was, I imagine, in line with expectations and certainly not going to be the last that we have this year, if predictions are correct.
It certainly, I don't think it will certainly be the last, and you're right, it was not a surprise. Actually, they are sitting again in May. I think we might see another 25 basis points hike, as we saw yesterday. And I think this is not just what we're experiencing as South Africans there, and you will see that economies around the world are also grappling with this rise in inflation. And as expected in general terms, higher interest rates, are a policy response to rising inflation. It is a necessary lever for slowing down in inflation. And I think, to your point, we are actually being unfortunately affected by what is going on around the world. In this case, the Ukraine invasion by Russia is the necessary evil that has made us to find ourselves where we are finding ourselves at the moment. But I really think that monetary policy in this country has always done its best to ensure that the inflation targeting regime continues to be protected. And I think, they still put in place necessary interventions to ensure that the economic growth and sustainability can actually be balanced. And what is happening is really a necessary evil. The unfortunate thing, Leanne, is that it's actually going to severely negatively impact consumers, especially in the tough economic climate and environment that we're actually finding ourselves at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a very, very difficult situation we're finding ourselves in, and we know that this is really just the beginning. The one thing that the Reserve Bank did say yesterday, I mean, Kganyago basically saying that in functioning advanced economies, central banks protect the public. Where does South Africa fall in that statement? I mean, in terms of whether it is actually a functioning economy right now?
The Reserve Bank is doing what it needs to do. You remember, and their primary mandate is to protect the value of the currency in the interest of balanced and sustainable economic growth. And they also have a statutory mandate, to enhance and protect financial stability. So when inflation does what it does, they have no choice, but in an effort to ensure that a sustainable economic growth is maintained, they actually have to hike interest rates so that they can see how they actually bring the demand for goods and services down. And with the demand for goods and services down, because there's less people who are actually affording goods and services, it therefore means, inflation is therefore going to go down. And I think that is how you try to balance and keep inflation within, the bracket that we've set for ourselves, which is 3 to 6%, as it were. So they are doing what reserve banks are actually doing the world over. And I think when you speak to external stakeholders, especially the credit rating agencies, they will actually tell you, and have said over and over again, that the South African Reserve Bank's inflation targeting regime and their credibility are an important credit strength and institutional strength for the country. So the integrity of the Reserve Bank and their independence honestly have to continue to be protected, and defended all the time, because without such strong institutions, without the Reserve Bank bowing down to economic and political or resisting economic and political pressures, South Africa would definitely be worse off. We think we're in a bad situation now, but if, the governor and the Reserve Bank were to stop doing what they're doing and bow down and try to respond to some of the pressures that we're actually facing as a country, then things would be definitely much, much worse.
So, I mean, when we look at economic growth, so the Reserve Bank saying that economic growth remains lower and is constrained by factors such as load shedding and policy uncertainty. this, of course, this discussion straddles yesterday's investment conference, where we're seeing all these commitments for industries to invest into the country. But I mean, when you look at the challenges that are facing South Africa in terms of these investments and the backdrop of all of this, what impact do they have on these policies? And we know that these are investment commitments. They're not actual. It's not like we're seeing that money that's coming through already. These are commitments that over the years we may or may not see. Talk to me about this and the backdrop of what we're experiencing.
And I think we would have had the president say yesterday that so far as the country, we have only banked about 174 billion, which is 2/3 of the 1.3 trillion rands that we would like to raise as a country. I think there was more commitments of about 340 billion yesterday. But it is precisely that, it is commitments, important commitments, Leanne, because we can't have the right levels of economic growth, or we can't have our economy growing at the right levels if there isn't investment commitments. And investment commitments will come because there's business confidence, and business confidence will come because investors and funders and businesses are seeing government doing the right things, as it were. So once you have the economy growing at the right levels, you will therefore, start seeing us more effectively attacking this notion of unemployment, as it were. Because there is no way that you can actually create jobs in an economy that is not growing, and our inflation doing what it's doing, it's actually not helping. If you look at more advanced economies like the US, the inflation is sitting at 2%, and people are actually complaining. So the big issue in the South African context is precisely because our weak economy and our low growth track that we're experiencing, currently means, that inflation is going to do what it's currently doing, sitting at 5.7%, and therefore all interventions have to be put in place to ensure that we can actually manage it, as it were. So government, therefore, in response to the commitments that have been made, is going to have to make sure that the promised structural reforms are actually effective. Because the structural reforms will mean that you sit with a more conducive environment within which business can be operated or business can be conducted. And if government continues to fail to deliver on their promises, then unfortunately the 340 billion that we saw being pledged yesterday is actually not going to be spent. I think what people don't say when they stand up on the podiums and when they stand up on the stage, as they did yesterday at the Central Convention Center making these commitments, is that there are implicit conditions precedent to these commitments that they are making. And one of those basic conditions precedent is that the system has to work. The network industries at the very least has to work, which is energy security, which is the ports, which is the rails, which is the municipalities, which is the spectrum or the telecoms infrastructure, and so forth and so forth. So government, therefore, really needs to look at how are they going to accelerate their efforts to ensure that, we can deliver on producing and creating a conducive environment so that we can see our economy starting to grow at the right levels, as it were.
So, it's quite an interesting statement that was in an article published on the BLSA's website. I'm just going to take a line from it, basically saying politicians will choose whichever monetary policy that will get them re-elected, but independent central banks must stick to their mandates. Let's elaborate a little bit more on this now, in light of everything that we've said.
And governments would normally bow down to the pressure of what the public is calling upon them to do, right? We are currently sitting in an environment where the consumer is taking serious heat, where there is 45.6% unemployment in terms of the expanded definition, where you have more people that are unemployed than those that are employed in all the provinces except Gauteng and the Western Cape. Youth unemployment of more than 70%. Government has put in place an unemployment grant, and they are talking about introducing a basic income grant when we know very well as a country that we cannot afford it. But they have to respond to where the country is and what the economy is facing. There are just too many people who are unemployed, and they have to be seen to be responding to that. So I think rising inflation, rising interest rates in this environment where a lot of people are depending on the 350 unemployment grant, would mean that there's going to be more pressure, on government to actually ensure that they actually intervene. I was having a conversation with some of my colleagues, and they were saying that government is going to have to intervene with a planned fuel hike next month, which is going to see the fuel going up to 24 rands, So they are under immense pressure. So when they are under such pressure, and when there are so much pressures experienced by the South African consumers, these often spill over into the threats of the independence of the Reserve Bank, and it therefore starts debates over non-conventional economic policies. Inflation rises, the Reserve Bank has no choice but to hike interest rates. So government would therefore want to look at how do you actually make sure that you make it easy for consumers? And they would want to force the Reserve Bank to actually keep the interest rates where they are, or worse, even reduce interest rates, when we know very well that in terms of our inflation targeting regime, you cannot do what government would expect you to do during this time, right? And I think part of the argument is that government should control monetary policy and manipulate interest rates in the country's interest. So that cannot be allowed to happen. We are not saying it's going to happen, but we have seen it over and over again, that when we are finding ourselves in the environment that we find ourselves in, then people start asking questions, especially with the announcement that was made yesterday. The response would be, but is this Reserve Bank serious? Don't they see what we are currently facing as a country? Don't they see the current pressures that are faced by consumers? Government, you have to intervene, and you will see government really, trying to intervene, and starting to have these discussions with the Reserve Bank in the interest or in an effort of trying to manipulate monetary policy, which is not going to work. So I think we were calling for that because we could see that with where we find ourselves, with the global pressures that we're facing, which are brought in by the Ukraine invasion, could see a government that is actually going to, in an effort to try and respond to what the consumers and the South African public is calling them to do, you could actually see them, turning to the Reserve Bank and saying, monetary policy, the same way that fiscal policy, is trying to intervene, monetary policy is going to have to do the same thing. So our view is that leave the Reserve Bank to do what it needs to do. They've got a primary mandate that is derived from the Constitution, and government has absolutely no business trying to intervene in it.
So just finally, let's wrap this up and let's make this relevant to everybody watching, because sometimes when we speak in these levels, people don't necessarily understand what it means to them. What they do understand is that when you drive to the petrol station, you are going to pay from next month around 24 Rand a litre of petrol. When you go into the shop and you fill up your trolley, you are getting far less than you were before the Ukraine-Russia incident happened. And that's not the only factor that's contributing to higher prices in terms of food. We're seeing it skyrocket right now. I mean, sunflower oil, wheat, everything, all the basics are increasing. And that war doesn't look like it's going anywhere, but instead it just seems to steadily be getting worse. Then, of course, there is electricity prices that are moving higher and higher, and we're moving into winter. And this is where we see even more problems coming when it comes to the power supply. Rates and taxes are going up, no matter what way we look at it. The reality is that salaries are not going up. They are decreasing, and the unemployment is growing. What are we going to do?
Yeah, I think that's the $1 million question, Leanne. I think trying to stimulate our economy is actually our best. That is something that is within our control. You do have foreign direct investment that is trying to look for economies, that will give them good net capital returns, as investors. And I think South Africa is going to try to have to do a better job in terms of positioning ourselves, to be able to attract that foreign direct investment. Because as I said earlier on, it is only through investment that you can have your economy growing at the right levels. And with the economy growing at the right levels, because I think the big thing that we have to arrest in our environment is this joblessness. It's this high unemployment rate. So I think with the economy, growing at the right levels, you can therefore start seeing demand, increasing, of businesses having to produce more. And with businesses having to produce more, they have no choice but to actually employ more people. So I think what is within our control right now, because what's happening in Ukraine and Russia is not within our control, but what is within our control is how do we actually make it more conducive, for capital to land here, through the many issues, red tape, rigidities that were actually already elaborated before. And I think government is going to have to put all hands on deck to make sure that we can deliver.
All right, we leave it there for this morning. Thank you. Thanks so much for joining us here on the program, and always a pleasure speaking to you. Busi Mavuso, who is, of course, the CEO of BLSA, discussing the collective decision of the Monetary Policy Committee to raise interest rates by 25 basis points. And the decision was really a toss-up between 25 and 50 basis points hike among the committee members, with some economists saying this could be what South Africa might be in for this year. We'll see more of these increases. And this is due to a multiplicity of shocks, including oil prices, food prices, supply constraints, and of course what we're seeing in Russia and Ukraine.